Okay, I've started recording. And we'll probably have a few more joining us. So if I pause in my introduction, it's because there's people in the waiting room dying to join us. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's so good to have you all here. Super excited about this. My name is Sally Phelps, and I am the Director of External Programs and Partnerships here at Olin. And I work on alumni programs such as this Learning Lab tonight and the Frank Talk series. And I did want to mention, as I just said, that we are recording. So welcome to the first segment of our latest Learning Lab featuring alumni working in sustainability. Tonight's session is called Software Careers and Climate. Before we get things rolling, I'm pretty excited to introduce a new staff member here. Vernell, do you want to give a wave? Vernell just joined us a little over a month ago. She's our new Director of Constituent Relations, and she's working hard to get to know our alumni and our parents and friends of Olin. So please say hello to Vernell if you do get a chance. Wonderful to have you here. All right, so let's get things rolling. 2 weeks ago, Olin graduated its 18th class, and we now number close to 1,400 alumni. Can you believe that? Class of 12?
Yeah,
we didn't have hardly any when you guys graduated.
Yeah.
And at a growing rate, these seniors have grown into alumni working in fields where they can truly have impact on the global challenges we're facing. They're working on the hard problems and they're finding solutions. I'm very excited tonight to introduce 3 of these alumni, and they're all from Olin's class of 2012. Stephen Zhang and Jamie and Jason Curtis will talk about frameworks for thinking about software careers and climate, as well as sharing some resources. And B, they'll challenge you to think about your personal career growth as a software engineer and professional. They'll share how they got to where they are today and how you can find the path that's right for you. A little bit more about them. Jamie and Jason built on their combined 20 years of experience in software and climate solutions to launch their own company called Option Zero. It's a software consultancy for climate companies and initiatives. Stephen runs climatetechlist.com, a company directory and job board for software engineers looking to work in climate. He's building up a huge following and sharing lots and lots of job openings and events. Stephen became an interviewing expert once after, I remember this, Stephen, because you were like calling me everywhere at all hours. Stephen managed to get 18 offers out of 22 sets of interviews in his job search. So you could say he knows a little something about this. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to our team. Take it away. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much for the intro, Sally. So let me share my screen. Cool. Everyone can see this?
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, and by the way, our audience, I think we're at the number where if you have a question, just feel free to interrupt at the end of a slide or type your question in the chat and Sally will pick that up. Cool. It's great to be here. 10 years after I graduated, 11 years, I guess, and to be with former classmates, Jason and Jamie. So I'm Stephen, and we're going to give kind of a 2-part talk today. So a little bit about ourselves. And Jamie and Jason, when they do their part, they're going to be doing more in-depth intro as well. So, oops, sorry. As Sally mentioned, I currently run climatetechlist.com, which is a climate tech job board or a job board for software engineers interested in climate tech jobs. And it's turned out that was my original target, but a lot of software engineer adjacent positions have also been interested. So talked to a lot of PMs, data scientists, just people coming from software tech in general. And the reason I got into this is for the last 2 years, I've been doing climate tech investing and also community building. In the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a big uptick in climate tech investment. So that's part of the reason I've been doing it. I also was really interested in it in when I was at Olin, but I graduated kind of when that bubble burst. That was called Clean Tech 1.0. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like to ask. So kind of 10 years later, here we are. I also run a newsletter. It's a very lightweight newsletter, bostonclimatetech.com. If you're based in the Boston area, there's also corresponding newsletters in New York, which are run by friends, San Francisco, London, a couple others, but we basically compile all the in-person events and send it out as a newsletter every 2 weeks. And in my previous roles, I was a full-time software engineer at Airtable and Tableau. And then, yeah, again, Jason, Jamie will talk about their intro more in depth when they go. So the 2 parts we're going to do today are going to be thinking about careers in general, like software careers in general in climate, and that'll be by me. Spend about 10-15 minutes on that, and then Jason and Jamie will talk about their personal journey in thinking in doing climate tech full time and tying that into personal career growth. And again, I think just to emphasize, for me, where I'm coming from and talking about software careers in climate is I've just talked to a lot of people looking to pivot into climate or looking to get a second job in climate, looking to start stuff in climate. I have logged over 150 conversations, probably had way more in the last 2 years. So that's where a lot of the content comes from. Great. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to talk about is frameworks to think about climate. So most of you probably know climate change, it's a problem, emitting too much greenhouse gases. It causes overall change in temperature in the earth that disrupts natural systems, really bad all around. How do you think about this though for jobs, right? So for like companies, what are some ways we can anchor companies in frameworks? So one framework I would like to share is what's called the bits versus atoms framework. So this was developed first by a relatively famous VC, Fred Wilson of Union Square Ventures. And then I think also there was another, I'm forgetting the second person, but anyways, Fred Wilson and some others came up with this idea of like bits versus atoms in general, right? If you're doing a company, are you mostly focused on software, which is bits, or are you all the way on the other spectrum, which is atoms, hardware? And there's also bits coordinating atoms, right? Like Uber is software that's coordinating the movement of atoms versus, let's say, Airtable or Tableau, previous companies I've worked at, they're really just moving bits for the most part. You're like the end output is bits. And then there's, atoms, and you could probably think of a lot of companies in that category. Now, when we developed this framework, this was developed in a community called My Climate Journey, or MCJ. It's a big Slack group of aspiring founders and current founders and job seekers. And a couple of us worked together to develop this framework. And that's the second link in the slide. And I can link to it at the end of the presentation. But essentially, we combine the bits versus atoms framework with this categorization of different ways you can work on climate change. So you can work on reducing the total amount of carbon, that's the yellow, carbon GHG stock reduction. So some examples of that would be like carbon credit marketplaces or agricultural plays for like sequestering more carbon depending on what plants you grow. Reducing the carbon flow, so the amount we emit, right? So that's typically what people think of, like let's stop using so much oil, let's electrify more things. And another category is adaptation, the third row. Some warming is going to happen, or it's already happening. How can we make sure that results in the least amount of disruption, suffering to society as possible? And so that's another row. And then we kind of have another catch-all category, enablement. And using this 2x2 or X versus Y axis matrix, you can kind of think about different companies in here. If you're a software engineer or software professional looking for climate tech jobs, there's a couple ways you can use this framework. One is moving bits is probably most suited for your skill set, right? If a company is just in the moving bits column, you can probably be pretty sure that your job is going to be valued or valuable to the company. That's probably the primary driver for the company's success and impact on climate. However, if your company is all the way on the other end, primarily moving atoms, that doesn't mean software isn't important. I think it'll just be important to figure out you'd have to figure out if software is important to that company. So that's one way. Another way you can use this framework is through the rows, the y-axis. Some people prefer to work on reduction and mitigation, the yellow and green rows, and don't feel like maybe working on adaptation is kind of misaligns incentives. Maybe that's not what they want to work on. Or if that's you, then use this framework and try to figure that out beforehand. And then finally, when we first made this framework about a year and a half ago, the number of companies on here, maybe it's like these green box, these blue boxes, these gray boxes times like 5. There's probably like 2 or 3 or 4x more of these companies out there. I think Climate Tech VC is the newsletter that collates a lot of this data. They have at least in the thousands of companies that in their newsletters they write about. So basically, you can start with one of these categories and then kind of branch out from there if you're looking for similar groups of companies. One way you could do that is literally just Google the company names, right? So in each of these circles, you can each of these groups, you can say like Remora, Heirloom, Living Carbon, competitors, or Remora and Heirloom rather, because they're all in direct air capture, and then that could be a jumping off point for your jobs. Great. I'm going to share one other framework. This one's a little easier. It's just a list. So Project Drawdown is a nonprofit. They've compiled a list of tens, if not 100 solutions, and they actually categorize each solution by the total like CO2 equivalent that would be reduced or sequestered in the next 30 years if we fully implement this solution. I think that number is a little bit harder to apply directly because every company is only going to do help a slice of that, but it can kind of give you an idea of like how big is this problem space. Sometimes you want to work in large problem spaces, but a lot for other problem spaces there are a lot of incumbents already. So if you were thinking about working on something that's neglected, you may want to go for like a smaller drawdown area, but just this framework is very helpful to think about companies. So I won't go into details. You can go to drawdown.org and look at some of these areas, and they have in-depth profiles for each of them. But I'll give 2 examples of companies that I've listed on Climate Tech List that apply to each of these. So one would be, Drawdown has this category called efficient trucks. So make trucks fuel efficient, either by retrofitting them, building new ones as electric, etc. Turns out there are many companies doing something adjacent to that, and one of them is NextEra Mobility. So they were a startup that they were called EIQ Mobility. They got acquired by NextEra Energy, which is like a large utility plus conglomerate, and they're making software to help existing fleets electrify their fleet. Existing fleet owners electrify their fleet. So, if you're a trucking company, you own 100 trucks, you got to figure out like which ones should I electrify first. You have to there's a lot of math and data behind that. You want to electrify the things that are high impact first, the ones that are maybe shorter. I don't know exactly the details, but there's a lot of data and software there. And I think NextEra works with these fleets, but they don't own any of the fleets directly, right? So they're a pure software play. Another example would be building retrofitting. And Drawdown has this category. An example of a company working in that, Lumen Energy. So They basically make software for building analysis. Like you can upload your utility data and they'll do automate some of that and have interactive tools to help the building owners plan out their retrofits. And with each of these companies, you can go to Climate Tech List to find out more. Each of these companies, I have like on the front page, like a short description of each, as well as in-depth profiles of each company with 3 questions I like to ask as a software engineer. What's the role of software at the company? Why is this company going to have a measurable impact on climate change? And finally, what is the future growth opportunity of this company? And I will be talking about that next. Why do we care about the future growth of a company? Well, it's tied to a couple things. One is if you are working at a company that becomes 100x bigger and you're working and it has direct measurable impact on climate, your climate impact is probably going to be 100x bigger, something along that order of magnitude, right? So right now, there's a lot of these startups. There's some big players. Tesla is an example from 10 years ago that has had definitely like a net positive impact on climate. So Tesla 10 years ago, 15 years ago was not that big, right? So if you join at that time, you would end up having a fairly large impact on because just from working at the right company. And similarly, right now, hopefully all of these companies, the thousands of companies become really big and all have that impact. But in reality, the nature of like technology innovation means that that's not going to be the case. So I think picking the right company as best as you can is an important thing to do. So I'll show a couple frameworks for how to think about that. As I mentioned, right, like you can have a company all the way to the left where they're just starting out, you don't know what traction they have, to a large company all the way to the right where they've kind of already succeeded, they're going to keep growing, and like maybe the rate of growth isn't that big. And I'm defining rate of growth as employees and revenue and just impact in general. You can ask me in the Q&A if you want me to delineate, just kind of a proxy. I'll just use growth as that word. So one way to think about this is you could join this middle part. You can model company growth as an S-curve, where at the beginning, they're trying to find product market fit. They're trying to get their initial, flywheels going. And it's very risky, especially if you're a new grad, to join because, you could be there for a year and out of a job the next year if they fail, and you don't really have much to show for it in terms of like personal growth. And there's some downsides to joining like a large established company too. And maybe a sweet spot to think about, I'm not saying this is true for everyone, but one thing to think about is this middle period where they have a lot of traction, they have product market fit, they're growing. In this macro environment, maybe that means they're growing like 50% a year, right? I'm not talking like 2 or 3x a year. And in a couple of years of staying at that company, you'll both learn a lot and have quite a big impact, especially if it's a climate tech company. So that's one way you can think about like your personal career as a software engineer. Another reason to join these companies is, especially in startup ecosystems like Silicon Valley and Boston, joining a company early gives you a lot of credibility because you could say, oh, I was employee number 100 at Tesla or some other large climate tech company now, or Nest, right? And people instantly give you that credibility. And finally, another reason to join kind of at this time period is the network. So I have a friend who coined this term, the Tesla halo effect. You can read about it in the website linked on the top left. He basically compiled a map of all the SpaceX and Tesla founders. So I think SpaceX is on the right here and Tesla's on the left. And yeah, he started this, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, and it got a lot of views on the web because just the sheer number of companies started by these alumni. Basically, if you had joined early enough to be part of that network, to know a lot of these people, a couple of years later, you now have a peer group of people that are, started maybe the next version of Tesla, or maybe not a company quite as big, but something along those lines, right? And it's a really good network to have. In fact, there are investment groups formed around this where, like, maybe it's a group of investors and their thesis is basically, let's invest in alumni of this company because it's so successful that we trust that they've trained people well, et cetera. Especially for Tesla, a lot of the companies, I don't think you can see the logos exactly, but a lot of the companies started by Tesla founders, Tesla alumni, are climate tech companies. And some of them are on climate tech lists as well. So yeah, that's just another framework you can think about. So to wrap up, showed you a few frameworks about how to think about climate and showed you a few frameworks to think about career growth. And you can ask me in the Q&A if you have any more questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Jason and Jamie.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well now. All right, can y'all see that? Okay, so Stephen has been talking about frameworks for working in climate and also some frameworks for your own career development. And we're going to look at both of those through the lens of our own career paths and add some of our own spin on Stephen's frameworks. We have some very similar opinions with slight variations. So one of the things that I've thought about in my own career is this tension between developing skill and applying skill. And I've often been doing both at the same time. Like, you can certainly be learning things and applying things that you've already learned. But there's also definitely been periods in my career when I've been significantly more biased in one direction or the other. So especially when I think back to my early career, I was very biased towards the developing of the skill. I think this is particularly interesting for Olin grads, or at least for myself coming out of Olin as an ECE major with a lot of soft skills like teamwork and communication and a really strong ability to learn, but not that much professional software development knowledge. And so for me, and I think for many Olin grads or many CS grads, I think it's worth considering the first 2 to 4 years of your career as more of an apprenticeship in which you're becoming a software engineering master. There's just a really big delta between the types of toy problems that you solve in classes, even if it's a full project, versus collaboratively architecting and extending an existing code base over multiple years with multiple different teammates. That gets you to professional level software development. So in that early phase of your career, you, in my opinion, should definitely be focusing on developing your skill. And if you also get to be applying your skill to have impact on the missions that you care about, that's great. But if I was to pick one, I would actually bias towards the developing skill. So here's another graph that's somewhat actually similar to Stephen's breakout list graph, or at least it's arguing for the same thing for slightly different reasons. This is definitely imperfect, and it's kind of my simplified rule of thumb, but I would say that on average, as company size increases or it gets later stage or becomes more established, mentorship increases with size, but ownership decreases. You can definitely learn from both of them. Like, you can learn a lot from somebody just telling you something, and you can also learn from getting thrown in the deep end and not knowing anything and figuring it out, like the Olin spiral learning. But it can be worth it to explicitly emphasize one or the other of those at various points in your career. So similar to Stephen arguing for that mid-stage company for this like breakout potential and high career growth potential, I would also argue for that mid-stage startup for this like early career sweet spot of both mentorship and ownership. A company will be big enough to have some structure around like code review feedback and a design process, but small enough that you can take a big chunk of the pie and run with it and make your own mistakes and learn from them. So along the bottom of this graph, we're actually just have some examples of some of the companies that we've worked at. And we're going to take basically a chronological view of that to just illustrate what we learned at different points in our journeys. So starting on the left, we both went to Olin, of course. We were 2012 graduates. I was an ECE, Jason was an E with C. But in actuality, mostly we just did robotics. We just liked writing code that interacted with the physical world. One of our most fun projects from our time at Olin was co-founding and building the first Olin sailbot. So we just had a grand old time at Olin, writing code for robots, essentially. But when we graduated, it was harder to figure out how to apply that skill and find a job that was also mission oriented. And in the end, I actually ended up on this Microsoft or Olin to Microsoft PM funnel, along with, I think, literally a third of my class. We all ended up as PMs at Microsoft. And Jason ended up at a different startup. And Microsoft, obviously a huge company, very far on the right of that graph. I found it to have really excellent career mentoring. There were classes for new grads that taught me things like eat your frogs in the morning and do the big rocks first, and gave me really constructive feedback on how to become a better PM, which is actually a very challenging and poorly defined role. And I was given ownership of a very, very small feature and spent most of my time coordinating with other teams across Windows to build that one tiny feature. And I spent an entire year there working on a single point release of Windows with this very, very small feature. So after about a year, I realized I wasn't really inspired by the mission at all. And I didn't really like being a straight PM. So I ended up quitting my job to join Jason at Energy Savvy.
Because meanwhile, right out of Olin, I had joined a super small clean energy startup called Energy Savvy, filling one of these really interesting niches that you don't think about until you think about it, that they're supporting utilities and helping their homeowners use less energy. So basically trying to increase energy efficiency across the board in residential homes in the United States. And so it was a super small team. I joined number 17, which was perfect size for me to join as a super junior dev, have them ready to rely on me, but also have a backstop of a lot of experienced folks to back me up. Frameworks that were set up, like constructive feedback on code reviews, really good feedback culture, the right level of process, so that I could see a whole lot of cycles go by. And then ultimately I grew in that role to build a new product from scratch. I built out the team for that product. And I just learned tons of things about seeing this growing company. And it didn't end up as a $1 billion company, but it did have an exit, but I still learned a ton in that process.
Yeah. So when I came into Energy Savvy, I basically had the same experience, benefited from the same things. I came in as a junior dev. I didn't really understand version control. I was pretty iffy on the difference between the front end and the back end. And with that strong mentorship culture, within 2 years, I was a team lead also. So when we look back on our time at Energy Savvy, we both really see it as this super foundational building block of the rest of our careers. We basically went in as new baby grads, and we came out more or less as senior engineers with technical leadership experience. Another thing that's actually, I think, worth pointing out, mentioning back to Steven's argument about getting that network from being an early member of a startup that has some success. We have had a lot of benefit just from having all these other folks that we worked with at Energy Savvy that we have very close relationships with that have gone on to work at other clean energy companies. And so, skipping ahead a little bit, when we got into our consulting business, that network was some of the first people that we called and some of our most helpful leads for new clients.
Yeah, so ultimately, there's amazing things about being an Energy Savvy, but also I ended up feeling a little bit stagnant after 4 years because there was only so much space to learn there. And I took an opportunity to be the CTO at a tiny 2-person startup, completely remove that backstop, 100% ownership, 0% mentorship, zero infrastructure systems to build off of. Largely because I was curious of okay, what if I did this more of like an Olin style project of like go from zero to something, but do it in the real startup world and learn about business development and how you intersect like the ULCD with the user-oriented design with the sales calls to people. How many times do you send an email before you give up? And together with building software from scratch without the more experienced folks to back me up.
Yeah, so one of the main things that Jason learned from UpRope is how to fail fast. They iterated super quickly, had a lot of these customer communications, and they discovered that they didn't have product market fit. There just was not a sellable product in the market that they were looking at.
Not for the amount of money that we wanted to make.
The amount of money they wanted to make, yeah, sure. That's a good point. So around the time that Jason was wrapping up his brief but bright stint at UpRope, I was also getting to the end of the period that I wanted to spend at Energy Savvy. We actually both decided to quit and do the very millennial van life sabbatical. We spent about 6 months driving around in our van, climbing and skiing. Would be very happy to answer questions about that in the Q&A, that's somewhat off topic. And that came to an end when our good friend and fellow Olin graduate, James Regulinski, gave us a call and essentially convinced us to join his new startup, Osmo Systems. So Osmo was building a water quality sensor for shrimp farming to try to make aquaculture essentially just more efficient. So it was climate adjacent, or at least we could kind of convince ourselves it was. And we were excited to join partially because we were excited to get back to that software hardware interface. We were kind of into that bits coordinated atoms space. We also just really liked working with James. And we liked the idea of working at this like relatively small size startup. This is a 10-person startup. And yeah, really having the shifting onto that left side of the graph with the very high ownership, very low mentorship, dive in, apply our skills, see what we're capable of without much backstop. We were hired as software engineers, and we definitely contribute a lot of IC code, but I think that the biggest thing we contributed to the team was a much crisper, agile process and ability to get the team agreed on what problems to solve and then figure out how to solve them or if they were solvable. After we joined, the team did a very efficient path through trying to get our technology to work, including a major detour through deep learning, like just trying to throw compute power at it, and concluded again that we had basically failed fast. The technology wasn't really viable. So Osmo Systems ended up folding, and we came to the end of our time there, ready to kind of sit down and really think more concretely about what we wanted next in our careers. At this point, we had this very solid foundation from Energy Savvy of being kick-ass software engineers. We also had a lot of experience working with this uncertainty of the small startup life. And for me, the two things that I came out of it were I wanted climate impact and I wanted mentorship at a certain level. I wanted specifically mentorship in team management, but I also wanted to have high ownership within an engineering team. And my process for deciding on that first one, the climate impact, was kind of very similar to Steven's graph of the drawdown chart with all the different like carbon footprints of all the different areas. We basically listed out like 50 climate tech companies, estimated just like total guesstimates of their carbon footprint, and then divided by the number of employees to see what our personal slice of the carbon impact pie would be. And use that just kind of as a rough gauge for if we join this company, will we actually make a difference? Based on that and based on their management mentorship program, I decided to join Convoy, which is an efficient trucking startup, though not the way that Stephen was talking about earlier, which is making the trucks themselves more efficient. It was much more about efficient logistics. So this, again, this like bits coordinating atoms concept. where the goal of Convoy was to reduce empty miles driven by trucks. Really very interesting technical challenge. So I ended up spending 2 years at Convoy, and then simultaneously, Jason ended up at Meta.
I joined Meta because I was a little bit burned out on climate change for a minute, and I thought that we maybe needed to fix the social fabric and societal polarization a bit. And Meta being the world's biggest having the world's biggest social platforms, it seemed like a good place to try that out. I spent a couple of years pushing that boulder up the hill with limited success or mixed success, let's say. And that brings us to our next step. At this point, we had a baby. I was stressed out of my mind at Meta, and I quit to be a full-time dad, which was actually an upgrade, believe it or not. And Jamie was laid off from Convoy in the same year. And we, after taking a break, we sat down and agreed on 2 goals: that we wanted to do something that had climate impact and something that let us work about 50% time. So a good way to do that, we realized, was to try out consulting for climate tech companies. And so we formed Option Zero. Our first stage there was, it was definitely, Option Zero is much more focused about applying skill, because that number 1 goal is about impact, but it also ends up being very much about so many opportunities for growth here too. But the first stage there was finding the overlap between our strengths. So these are what our skills were. We've learned in the last several years to do web development, data wrangling, work at the software hardware interface. And then at the bottom left row, there's those softer skills, product management and team leadership that I think Olin tends to give people a leg up on out of college, but we also sort of forged ourselves into higher skill levels through that career graph that you saw. So finding the overlap between those strengths and climate tech companies or climate organizations or non-climate organizations that are doing climate projects, what they need. We spent a lot of time in that exploratory space with networking. And after a few months, we started getting to work with them. We've worked with a variety of projects, and this will be our final framework, I think, that we think about. A lot of XY plots, a lot of. We didn't do any sticky notes. Dang.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we think about our work along this spectrum, where on the left we have more direction setting work, and on the right we have more implementation focused work. So the direction setting work is actually some of the more exciting to me. It tends to be smaller scale. A lot of this is working usually with people who have basically no software expertise, but they have some product market fit despite that. So they have, they're basically like, I'll bring the atoms, you bring the bits. I don't know anything about bits. And then all the way on the other end, on the left side, we're calling that fractional CTO is usually what it ends up looking like. And then on the other side, implementation, that tends to be companies that are more established. They have a software team. They know how to think about software, at least to some extent, and they just need people with a specific set of skills that we often have due to our backgrounds that will help their climate-related project go faster. So looking back on each of these projects tends to move back and forth between those sides, or just span a big chunk of it at the same time. But a lot of what I think makes us work well as a consultancy is this, our ability to work with customers to not only just help them understand and define their needs and then develop a plan from there, but also to make it happen. I think selling either one of those to people is relatively hard. But when we're talking to people about strategy and they're like, okay, but how do we make it happen? We're like, oh yeah, we can help you figure out how to hire, and we can also just build your MVP, because that's the quickest way to make it happen.
Another pattern we've seen there is folks hiring us because they think they want something to happen. So they hire us to write the code for it. And the value that we provide in the end actually ends up being much more on that earlier side, on making sure they're solving the right problem, or building a cheap MVP instead of a very complicated one. We have found definitely as consultants that it's easier to sell that like kind of code monkey skill. And once we've sold them on that in our actual conversations with them, our ability to set these frameworks around design, problem selection, intentional problem solving processes is probably actually what makes us most valuable to them.
It's hard to sell on its own though.
It's really hard to sell. It's really hard to sell strategy.
Yeah. So basically looking back on our careers, we can see that they've gotten to this point where we have the skill set to chase after projects on the left and the right and move back and forth across them. And we're learning about, to some extent, our sustainability expertise helps us. Sometimes there's like a fact that we know because of our experience, but more it's this ability to move back and forth, and the resume does help a little bit with selling to climate companies to make people convinced about that, about you. But definitely the careers and the path that we went through is what lets us do what we're doing right now.
That's everything we have in terms of prepared content. We will just open the floor for any questions. Oh, wow, Stephen, I just saw that you dropped my article about option 0. Yeah, I could go on a whole diatribe about option 0 and picking the right problem to solve, and sometimes you just don't solve that problem.
Yeah.
So feel free to raise your hand or just speak up or put your question in the chat. Some great resources here.
I'll start if no one else wants to ask a pressing question. I'm just curious what you might advise a student who is maybe in their senior year and thinking that they want to go into consulting. You both, you all worked for companies before, forging out on your own. Do you think that was valuable? Do you think you would have been able to just jump right into consulting after graduating? And what would you say to maybe a junior or a senior who's really ambitious about a consulting opportunity or a consulting career?
I think.
Oh, wow. It sounds like we're gonna have different opinions. I would pretty strongly advise against that. Maybe it depends on the particular subject matter, but I really do think that for me, at least, I graduated Olin with a really strong ability to learn. And then I had to go do a bunch of learning. And the mentorship that I got, especially those foundational years at Energy Savvy, was just invaluable. Like, it's hard to overstate, especially for software engineering in particular, the concrete value of putting up a pull request and then having a senior engineer review your code and give you very concrete suggestions, and doing that iteration basically every day for years. It's just that practice that you just have to do. And with this like expert feedback, it's just so valuable. And launching out on your own as a consultant without that kind of structured mentorship seems, I don't know, you wouldn't become as good of a software engineer, and then you won't have as much skill to apply when you want to make impact.
I also think there's the counterpoint to that is that there is obviously no one way to do it. And if you really have the opportunity and there's a good fit, then there's a ton you can learn, like I did at UpRope, just in the deep end. Yeah.
I'll add on to that. There are some companies that do full-time consulting, but it's in a company structure. So it's a little bit like management consulting, but for software engineers. ThoughtWorks is one example. And I think our year, someone joined Pivotal Labs. So they do pair programming basically with different clients. I think that would be, you could potentially get both in those. I mean, you definitely do get more mentorship, right? You're working with senior consultants and stuff.
Totally.
Yeah.
Krista, did you have someone in mind in particular, or are you just curious to dig in on that? Like, is there more context that you want to provide on that?
I do have someone in mind, yes, who wasn't able to join us for this call, but I would love to share this recording with them. And if you're open to being contacted for questions, I'm sure that this person would love to dig in a bit more.
Yeah, there's a contact form on our website that's here.
Awesome.
optiongear.co.
That would be great. Thank you.
And Sally can put us in contact too. Yeah.
And Stephen, you mentioned ThoughtWorks. What was the other one?
Pivotal Labs. I think they got acquired. They're part of like, I think their company's called Pivotal now. If you Google Pivotal Labs, they come up. And you can use
I think they got acquired by VMware.
Oh, VMware.
Right.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Looks like we have a question in the chat
From Ian, yeah.
from Ian. If you know you're going to be primarily developing skills and you want to make that clear to employers, how do you still say that in a way that gets them to hire you? My experience from the other side of that fence is that when you hire a junior engineer, you assume you're going to have to teach them a lot. You assume a base level of competence in like writing code, like you understand conceptually how code works and you understand some syntax of some particular language. So you'd be pretty disappointed if you hired somebody and they had no idea how to write code. But you definitely assume that you will, for quite a while, be mentoring them. So if a company is hiring for a position that's called a junior dev, or just like even a college grad dev, or just an entry-level dev, then probably what you have to sell them on more than your ability to code is just your ability to like think on your feet and communicate well.
I think at the same time, the question might also be like, when they're like, why do you want to work at our company? Your answer is like, well, because I want to learn from you. And that's actually okay. I think the other thing that I look for in junior folks, like I want signs that you're a lifelong learner, ideally.
Growth mindset.
Growth mindset for sure. Yeah. And that's ravenously hungry to learn. Yeah. Yeah. And you probably do want to have some interest in what they're doing. Because you probably won't be happy if there's a real mismatch in mission.
Vedant, you have a question, and then we'll go
sorry,
to
can I just add
Alan's
a comment
question.
to the last
Yeah.
To Ian's question? So I think, when you're doing the job search, I think you should be in the mindset of like whenever you interview, it should be like, this is the only company that exists and I want to do a good job, and then decide later whether you want to join them or not, right? I think a common mistake, I've talked to many people job seeking, and the common mistake people make is like, oh, can you tell me more about this company? Like, I just want to see if it's a good fit. I think that's good to do on the high level, but like, if you're pretty sure it's a fit, you need to like sell them, first, and also just get the offer, right? And then, especially in this market, once you get it though, I think you got to think about from the employer's perspective. They basically have spent a lot of money to get you to offer stage, so they want to close. And then similarly, once you're already there, the employer's goal is to retain you. But with that said, most Silicon Valley companies, I think the average stay is like 2 years, maybe not even 2 years, at least a couple of years ago. Maybe it's like 3 years right now, right? And so I think there's an assumption that there's going to be some kind of churn. And so, yeah, I think maybe you don't even have to like think about it necessarily. Just do the best job in the interview, and then yeah.
Vedant, go ahead.
Yeah, firstly, I want to say this is like super helpful, super great. I really like the framework. At least for me, it was super helpful to think about the whole applying versus developing skills framework, as you would see, was kind of like thinking about that. But my question kind of was, let me pull it up. It's kind of about something that I didn't hear, or that I couldn't quite answer for myself here. And it's this idea that climate tech right now seems to be tech in climate focused companies. And correct me if I'm wrong, but like, it doesn't seem like holding these roles involves like interdisciplinary knowledge. Like you can be coding and you can be in like, and you're just applying those skills in like a climate tech company. And I think I've tried to like actively build experience in both like software and in like climate justice and sustainability. So would you recommend like any spaces, if they exist, that leverage both experience in software and knowledge from climate justice and sustainability?
Yeah, so I can start with this one. So I think there's a difference between like what skills you have and the intersection that you provide, and then what on the employer end, what they want to hire for, right? And so when I was a new grad interviewing, I took a gap year after Olin, and I did Fulbright, was a journalist for a year, so pretty interdisciplinary, right? And I actually did environmental journalism in China, so pretty like lots of different things. But when I was interviewing, they didn't care that I did that. To be blunt, they were just like, a lot of people didn't know what Fulbright was, right? They're like career software engineers. They may have just, they're just not in circles that may know that or whatever. And I think it's only later in my career, especially now that I'm doing my own company or when I was doing investing and like connecting different people, where the interdisciplinary part becomes really key. So if you're especially if you're interviewing for a software engineer role, but even if you're like a junior PM role, I think it's pretty atypical that the other stuff matters as much. What I've heard from employers is that people care that you have a baseline level in climate, unless you're going to a very specific domain expertise role, which are probably not junior roles. They're just, they'll just assume they can teach you all the domain expertise on the spot. And really just, it's more important to emphasize like, what are the technical skills that you bring to the table that match the job description. That being said, I think one way you can go around this, if you want a way to integrate the two, is I've seen this small amount, which is do your regular job, whether that's climate tech or not, and then do writing on the side or some kind of like content creation. Get your ideas out there. When you write stuff on the internet, people will give you feedback, and you can just kind of build a reputation from there. And one example, this actually happens a decent amount when you have a lot of ideas and you have a lot of connections. One way people turn that into a business is they start a investment fund, right? So I have a friend who does a lot of like writing about urban solutions that are at the intersection of policy and tech. So it's not just tech, and they are starting a fund, right? And for a long time, they were kind of going back and forth between policy roles, and they're not software, but policy roles and then tech roles. And now they're able to bring the two together.
I love that. Stephen is constantly the content marketing evangelist. We have a weekly meeting with him, and every week he's like, "What articles did you write?" And we're like,
content creation. Yeah.
Sure, content creation. One thing I wanted to add, and this is basically what Stephen said, but just like really specifically, in my experience, software engineering roles, like job descriptions, are viewed pretty fungibly. Like I haven't seen many companies that are like, I want a software engineer who's also, I don't know, like environmental science interest or major or whatever. Software engineers are pretty much seen as like totally fungible. And it's not true that that's the experience once you get into a company, but the hiring pipeline, the like interview process, the entire way that you get a software engineer into a company is very generic. Yeah. And so I think you're going to have probably a hard time finding a role that says like software engineer X equity in sustainability, but more like what Stephen says, you can be a software engineer and either find a way to bring that into your role or find a way to apply it outside of your role.
Just one more, like when you do put your ideas out there, one nice thing about it is you just get inbound. A lot of like, you get a long tail, you basically increase your chance of getting lucky, is one friend who's a content creator says, right? So you might run into a founder who's like, hey, I'm looking like your essay about this. By the way, I saw your engineer. We're not going to hire you for this topic you wrote about, but we're also hiring for engineers, right? Something like that.
So question Alan had a while ago, how is the job market looking right now?
Sad face.
Yeah, I could take that real quick. So I started Climate Tech List originally, there was like this private Airtable shared view that I was shared with friends about a year ago. I compiled these companies, and one of the key insights I had at the time was everyone has too much choice, especially these senior engineer friends, 5+ years of experience. They get like, they spend 2 weeks and then they're just like, too many companies, I'm just going to take this well-known SaaS company, like climate's too complicated. And obviously that's changed a lot now. One, because of all the tech layoffs, and two, a lot of the companies aren't expanding as fast as before. So it's probably honestly like the hardest. I've heard, like, I don't have any concrete data, but I think it's like probably harder than GFCs, a great financial crisis. Like when me and Jason and Jamie graduated, it's harder. Probably going all the way to like .com bust. That being said, I think the silver lining is that it will get better, right? Software especially is very cyclical, and yeah, I think it will get better. And then two, the companies have the opposite problem now. I've talked to companies who, as a proxy, they use recruiters. So these recruiters or headhunters, I think it's called retained search, if that's the technical term. They will pay like 25% of first year base salary to hire someone. Before, they used retained search to like get people interested, because they could just the LinkedIn, outbound messages would never work. Now they use retained search to like filter, because they have like 1,000 applicants for one role, and the founder doesn't have time to look through everybody, right? So I think, lower expectations than before. You're not going to get, I would not get 18 offers, right, if I interviewed right now, probably. But I think, if you still do you just keep doing, the standard things, and I wouldn't say it's hopeless, is what I'm trying to say.
It sort of makes it even more important to like have PGP review your resume and just like play the game.
Yeah, I'm going to drop a link to an article that I wrote from our 2020 job search, where I just like wrote up my notes on our process. Like, we really played the game, like not quite as hard as Steven did. We had like
Not nearly as
5
it wasn't like
offers, not
Steven,
18 offers, 5 out of 7 or something, and not 18 out of 20. But there is, if you aren't familiar with this yet, maybe especially as a new grad, there's a big difference between the software that you write, the code that you write in an interview versus the code that you write in a job. And it's like a different skill set. You can sit down for 3 months and basically do like 100 leak code problems, and that will go really far towards getting you through the interview process at most companies these days.
I don't, it does also feel like the resume stage is just a hugely different funnel than it used to be. And I don't know much about how to play that game. But things like tailoring your resume to the company and talking to PGP.
Yeah, I mean, always try to get internal referral if possible. Having worked with recruiters now for a while, like on the climate tech list side, it's really interesting to see, right? Like, one thing that happens is, because you have 1,000 applicants applying for a job, you can afford to have false negatives. Like, you're like, well, this could have been a good candidate, but I just don't recognize this company. I have to look through 900 resumes, swipe left. So.
Is that literally a thing they have for resumes these days?
Probably.
Business idea.
Okay, we've got another question. In your view, is there any preference for climate tech companies for hiring grads from colleges over boot camps?
Yeah, I mean, that's always been true for all tech companies. The idea is that, like, if people look for a CS degree, that's like, a CS degree from top 10 school is like the gold standard. And again, that's not fair necessarily. They're having false negatives, but I think they're just trying to be efficient, right? And yeah, I don't really think there are any boot camps that are preferred over like solid CS or call it or CS EC backgrounds.
I do think,
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, in the last 10 years, there's been more recognitions that boot camps can turn out legit software developers. So it's not necessary, like, it won't be, it might work.
Well, yeah, but I think relatively speaking, there's probably more preference for college.
Yeah.
Right.
It might have also been somewhat of like an interim solution when there weren't enough CS grads and the entire industry was growing explosively, and boot camps just made sense. Like, if somebody could get trained up on coding in 6 months, that was better than not having anybody. But now that we have a glut in the market, yeah, maybe those traditional, not necessarily accurate, but simple filters for the 1,000 resume pile. I don't know that much about it. That's just me speculating.
Yeah, I'll just add one more point. The bits moving atoms and atoms climate tech companies, right? A lot of the people in recruiting don't have the software background, so they may not recognize like certain names that people that work purely in software recognize as like, so those heuristics are even more narrow, I would say.
And just a plug for what Steven said about trying to find someone who knows that company or knows that recruiter, you know, that personal referral goes a long way. I think we're through all the questions, unless I don't think I missed any. Give everybody one last chance. We are right on schedule. It is 8:01. Thank you so much, Stephen and Jamie and Jason. This has been fantastic. Thanks to all of our participants. Great questions. Really terrific group. Appreciate all of you joining us.
Oh, actually, I forgot to plug one more thing.
Go ahead.
Tiana reminded me. So, this is a fun story from Olin Network. I was chatting with Dan Lindquist, class of 06. He was a co-founder of a pretty well-known startup called Bain Street. And then we were chatting earlier this week, and I was like, oh, actually, we have a decent number of people working in climate tech, but also just starting companies in climate tech. So we came up with this directory, which you can check out here. Currently have 7 entries, but there's probably like 20, 30, even more people working in it. And a handful number of founders too. So if you want to join, there's a WhatsApp group as well, or just Oliners working in climate or interested in working in climate. Fill out the form on the site.
And many thanks, Stephen, for all the work you've done to create these job boards and these Slack channels. I mean, it's really, I think, a huge help for people trying to network in. So I would love to invite all of you to the next 3 in our series, which will take place in the fall. We're going to do a similar talk on energy systems, one on energy storage, and one on wind, all with 2 or 3 alumni in each topic. So they're out there doing good things. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a great night. Bye.
Thanks for organizing, Sally.
Bye.
Thanks all.